Hello. Um, yeah, for a short period today, we are going to discuss sexuality or who we choose to love in partnership in the United States of North America and relationship structures and how it intersects with bias and impacts the therapeutic relationship. To begin, just a few words about the spectrum of experience as it intersects with oppression and marginalization and sexism and bias in the United States of North America. When we're speaking of the group that is most biased and experiences the most bias and marginalization in our society, we're speaking of non-heteronormative or heterosexual relationships. Heteronormative and heterosexual are relationships between a cisgender man and a cisgender woman. They are the least oppressed and marginalized um, sexual choice and relational choice that we have in the United States. And folks that are non-heteronormative or heterosexual, that have relationships that don't just include either one cisgender man and one cisgender woman, or relationships that are cisgender male to cisgender male, or transgender or non-binary folks with cisgender folks in relationship, those are considered to be the most marginalized and oppressed sexual organizational relationships in our society. In terms of relational structure, we're talking about monogamous relational structure, as in two people in a relationship where they're committed to each other that involves nobody else in that relationship, and therefore stepping out of that relationship in any way would be seen as a violation or a infringement on the agreement in monogamy. The monogamous relationship is the most accepted relationship structure in the United States of North America. Therefore, they experience the least amount of marginalization and oppression, and more polyamorous and more open relationship structures experience the most sort of marginalization and discrimination in our society. Absolutely. Every human in any sort of relationship or sexual choice, relational choice, either the structure or whom they choose to love, is susceptible to stress and challenges and anxiety that arise in relationships, particularly romantic relationships between people, individuals or groups of people in relationships. That being said, and we are going to hold space for every client who is in any sort of relationship with whomever they choose to love and any relational structure that they choose to be in. That being said, this lecture particularly focuses on people whose sexuality is marginalized and the impacts of that marginalization on their mental, embodied, and spiritual experience. And folks that are in a relationship structure that is not the typical relationship structure in the United States of North America. And as in typical, I don't mean the one that makes the most sense or is the most acceptable to me, Professor Gallucci. What I mean is what the society sees as the most normal and therefore treats with the most respect and the least amount of marginalization and unfairness. That's what I mean by typical in this sense. Personally, I don't believe that there is a typical anything when it comes to who we love and how we structure our love. But within the context of the United States of North America, this is the framework in which oppression and bias live. This hierarchy that's imputed upon various choices around who one chooses to love and how they structure their love. Now, this is often seen as a spectrum approach where there is fluidity along that spectrum. And simply what that means for the sake of time is that one is changing often, right? They say authentic people change often, but it's not required, right, to be authentic. But that is one of the concepts. So, in terms of sexuality and who we choose to love, there's this concept that many people activate as a reality that who we choose to love can change over time. So, if you choose to love someone of the same gender, that may change over time to include people that are non-binary or of other genders, and that is okay. There is a fluidity to that, is what many people are believing in the United States of North America at that time. However, we do have laws and regulations and societal, institutional, and individual trauma and harm and prejudice that does arise when people try to impose on another person's right to choose their sexuality or the way they structure their partnerships. Those that attempt to control other people's sexuality and relational structures is often backed by institutions and a society that is often um, pro-monogamous and pro-heteronormative. As always, we will start with a sort of textual analysis that, in this case, begins with a sort of context and demographic, and then goes into some counseling implications, as well as a few other things that I'll touch on from the Sue text. Again, this is coming from Counseling the Culturally Diverse, which is the Sue text, a blending of, let's say, the eighth and ninth editions. And this text determines bias against LGBTQIA plus people. And I will get into what that acronym means because it's more than just letters, it's actual identities and human beings behind those identities. But it's biased against LGBTQIA people is described um, as the range of negative beliefs, assumptions, and behaviors that reinforce that heterosexual and cisgender identities as the normal, and therefore giving them more privileges and less disenfranchisement in society. There's a devaluing, a pathologizing, and a marginalizing of non-heterosexual orientation and gender diverse identities, and that is seen as bias against LGBTQIA plus people and their communities. This bias shows up as heterosexism, right? Assuming that everyone is heterosexual or that heterosexuality is superior or more natural. That's sort of putting our diversity into a hierarchy and imputing value to our diversity, which is the root of oppression in a lot of ways. There's cis normativity, which is assuming everyone identifies with the sex they were assigned at birth, which we discussed last week is definitely not the case when it comes to non-binary and transgender people, or that cisgender identities are more legitimate and deserving of fairness and lack of oppression in our society. There are many microaggressions, like everyday slights and invalidation, for example, asking your gay client about their real family or misgendering a trans person are ways that we can discriminate against folks in the LGBTQIA plus communities. And keeping in mind that there is a difference between gender identity and sexual identity, but there is a lot of intersection. We will mostly be focusing on the impacts of of sexuality and sexuality identity and relational structures today. And we did discuss gender identity in a past video. And I hope you watch both and see them as intersectional, but also deserving of exclusive consideration in terms of their experiences. There's a pathologizing, right? Framing LGBTQIA plus identities as a problem or a lifestyle rather than a valid variation in the human experience. And there's discrimination and stigmas that as I mentioned earlier, are backed by social, legal, and institutional practices that exclude and even harm LGBTQIA plus people, as in workplace bias, denial of healthcare, family rejection, and many more things. And these individual prejudices that LGBTQIA plus people experience, these cultural norms that are marginalizing to the LGBTQIA plus community, language, institution, and sometimes counseling practices themselves can have a negative impact on their experiences. And you may be in a relationship, in the therapeutic relationship with an LGBTQIA plus person who has had experiences of oppression that what they may want to work through in the therapeutic setting. We're not going to require our LGBTQIA plus clients to teach us about their identity, but we are going to open up space to validate their experiences with oppression and with joy of being LGBTQIA plus and work with them in ways that they would like to work around that. These identities include lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer questioning individuals and more that we'll discuss a few slides from now. And this is not, there are a decent amount of human beings that identify as non-heterosexual and non-heteronormative. And the more comfortable people are in making the choice about who they love and how they structure their partnerships, the more sexual choices and options become available, and the more natural expressions of sexuality come to fruition, um, the more that we oppose and fight against oppression of one's ability to engage in their natural sexual choice or in the choice to activate that in our society. A few strengths of the LGBTQIA plus population that's shared by a lot of marginalized populations, but specifically here are resilience and coping skills, creativity, adaptability, community and support networks, positive identity benefits, as in living authentically when allowed to, serving as role models, promoting social justice in a variety of forms, and being allies in a variety of settings to other marginalized people, and egalitarian relationships at times, right? At times, right? There's an equal partnership sometimes in the expansion of possibilities of relationships and relationship structures, but not always. There's still harm and trauma in the LGBTQIA plus community, and when your client shows up with those concerns, you are there to help them as well, and not just assume that because they're not heteronormative, their lives are peachy and there's no problems that exist in all romantic relationships, potentially, and challenges at times, particularly when you're working on couples counseling. Um, we're not going to fantasize or as a form of marginalization, the LGBTQA plus community as psychotherapists. I did mention some of the challenges, and then we'll get into some of the counseling implications. There's discrimination and literal violence, hate crimes, harassment, and again, microaggressions are common towards members of the LGBTQIA communities. Mental health risk, there's a heightened vulnerability, not to every LGBTQIA member or person, but there is a vulnerability to depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance use, suicidal ideation, particularly among the youth. And this is a consequence of a society that doesn't nurture and support people in being their authentic self. So it's a societal consequence, not a specific issue with the person who is LGBTQIA plus. It's the way that we as a society treat members of those identities. There's family and relationship stress. There's aging and healthcare discrepancies and disparities, and then there's intersectionality, right? LGBTQIA plus people of color, immigrants, and others with multiple marginalized identities face compounded bias, and that is something that we need to acknowledge as a systematic problem, not an individual, um, not the cause of an individual, and not pathologizing them, are us as members of this community if we are. There's some counseling implications to working with the LGBTQ plus populations that were brought up in the Sue text, right? Examining and challenging your own personal biases, examining your own values around sexuality, your religious beliefs, your cultural assumptions about sexuality. Um, and even well intentioned mental health counselors may unknowingly reinforce heterosexism, right? Mainly by assuming that heterosexuality is the norm. But there are many other ways as well. And through self reflection, supervision, these things are essential to prevent subtle microaggressions towards your clients that can impact the trust of your caring and helping relationship as a mental health counselor that I call the loving profession. You want to try to use inclusive and affirming language and take the time to learn what that actually means. You want to have intake forms that include open-ended relational categories and even gender categories because there is intersection as we've talked about. You're going to want to allow for pronouns to be respected as well as not invalidated. Avoid pathologizing language. Terms like lifestyle choice or preference, like I brought up earlier, minimize the validity of sexual orientation and gender identity, to be honest. And counselors should mirror the client's terminology for their sexual identity and their relationship structure. Normalizing and validating identity development is incredibly important here when it comes to sexuality, right? Coming out about our various sexualities that may not be heteronormative um, is not a single event, but it's a lifelong process that varies by culture, family, and one's safety in coming out. Counselors, your job is to validate both the courage to come out and the wisdom to stay private when necessary, particularly when it's a decision around safety. Therapy should affirm that same-sex attraction, bisexuality, and gender diversity are normal and variations of human experience. They're not pathologies, as I mentioned earlier. And also, you can be there to support your client in integrating their sexual identity with other aspects of self, like their cultural, spiritual, professional. Um, and this can help reduce internal conflicts that may just naturally arise with everybody around our sexuality and other aspects of our identity. You're going to want to recognize that there is the potential for trauma, but that not every member of the LGBTQIA plus community is traumatized. But the trauma often, um, the people that are traumatized in this community and any community often bear the burden of stress. Chronic vigilance against rejection, stigmas, and violence have an impact on our mental health, our spiritual, and our embodied experiences. You're going to want to not ignore historical trauma as a potential impact in to your clients that are members of the LGBTQIA plus communities, and allow space for those traumas to be brought into therapy if your client chooses to do so. You're going to want to really support families and relationships with families and try to work through cultural, religious, and generational conflicts if your client chooses to do so and if that's safe for them to do. And again, having this sort of intersectional awareness. Some of this is relative repeating of some of the things mentioned earlier in the Sue text, but it's all valid and important, right? Clients, LGBTQIA clients of color, people with disabilities that are LGBTQIA plus, people in poverty. There's a layered oppression that we cannot separate when we're supporting our LGBTQIA plus clients. And then advocating, as always, beyond the therapy room for systematic change to be to ultimately abolish marginalization of people based on their sexuality and how they structure their relationships. And honestly, like always in culturally competent counseling, in terms of maintaining that competency, it's a commitment to ongoing education, not only doing the inner work as a mental health counselor, but also learning more as things change. There is a fluidity and there is a growth and there is a transformative nature to sexuality and how it's showing up in our society, and embracing that and being up with the times, right, is valuable and important to you as a mental health counselor and to the relationship that you will have with your clients that are LGBTQIA plus. There are a few factors that determine, moving on away from the Sue text now, there are a few factors that determine sexual attraction. And again, essentially, we're talking about sexuality, love, passion, right? Um, Companionship, connection with another human being. This is what we all want for the most part in our society as people, right? This is what we want. We want connection. And it would be amazing if we all could connect with who we choose to and who we want to naturally connect with. And that may not always conform to the heteronormative structure of who we love. So there's biological sexual attraction, right? The endorphins, the adrenaline, the chemicals that arise, the chemistry of love in our bodies. There's psychological love, like the mood, our emotional love and impact in that case, and the positive feelings of acquiring partnership and sustaining it. And then there are other determinants, right? Like where you live really determines your access to various people, who is on the dating app, who's not on the dating app, if you're in a place where you're required to use that. Um, and past experiences also impact your sexual attraction. There's emotional attraction, which I believe is relevant to bring up, even though we're mainly talking about romantic attraction, right? And it's defined loosely as the ability to want to be emotionally present with another person. Now, this can be friends, family, partners, colleagues, a variety of settings. Emotional attraction and emotional support are things that we naturally want as people. And thinking of what it would feel like to be not allowed to have an emotional or sexual attraction to who you would like to. And I'm not saying forcing that on people that don't consent. This whole entire discussion is around consenting people in relationships that they are consenting to, right? So even when it comes to emotional relationships, there needs to be mutual informed consent about that. But we are emotional beings, and that is okay. And we are drawn towards each other in emotional and romantic relationships. So again, there's different types of attraction: sexual attraction, sensual, romantic, platonic, aesthetic. And mainly when we talk about sexuality and bias, we're speaking of sexual romantic attraction. And feel free to pause this and look deeper into each of these categories if that would be helpful. Here is the explanation, one of the many explanations of LGBTQIA+. We have lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, queer, questioning, intersex, an ally, asexual, and pansexual. And there are more. This is not an exhaustive list, but this is for an introduction for folks who may have never heard of some of these ways of being and ways of showing your love. Um, this isn't to force confirmation away from heteronormativity. If you're heteronormative, totally cool. Just maybe work to be inclusive if that's your choice. But in the mental health counseling profession, it is your legal and ethical obligation to not invalidate anybody who identifies naturally with any of these identities and more that exist. And please, again, feel free to pause this and read deeper into nuances of every one of these categories here. And another reminder that there's a fluidity here, right? Just because one day someone is experiencing their life in a way that they are showing up as a lesbian doesn't mean that someday they might not make a natural choice to expand that into being a bisexual being, right? So just keep that in mind that there's a fluidity that is supposed here that's often noted by the asterisks that you might see in LGBTQIA+. Now, how one structures their love, we're going to take a brief moment to just kind of go over this, because it is fundamentally different than who we choose to love. Who we choose to love intersects with how we structure our love, but every member of various sexual identities can choose to structure their partnerships differently. So ultimately, there is sort of a separation to a certain extent between who we choose to love and how we structure our partnerships, right? Lesbian, bisexual, heteronormative folks can all choose to structure their partnerships in monogamous or along the non-monogamous spectrum. And to clarify a little bit about terminology here, just briefly, this is an introductory lecture, and hopefully there's something here that you glean insight from that can help your mental health practice, and you dive deeper into your continued education around the diversity and expansion and expression of sexuality and how we structure our relationships. But here is a polyamory and open relationship start chart that I also recommend you pause and look deeper at. But polyamory, as in relationships with multiple partners, solo poly, right, dating oneself, swinging, couples who allow partners to have sex with other couples, monogamish, right, folks that are primarily exclusive but occasionally include dating others, polyfidelity, closed groups, usually including 3 or 4 partners, and relationship anarchy. Those are relationships with no rules or similarities to traditional monogamy, which again is um, two people that are exclusively in relationship with each other and not dating or experiencing emotional or romantic or sexual relations outside of that structure. You may have clients that identify along, excuse me, you may have clients that identify along the spectrum of monogamous to non-monogamous, and you may have couples and poly relational structure counseling experiences that include the spectrum of people and how they structure their love. And you are to show up fully and not invalidate their choices and their experiences as legitimate in a variety of relationship structures. There's this misconception that polygamy and polyamory are the same. And here's a little bit of information. Um, for the most part, polygamy is illegal in the United States of North America, and so is polyamory. But there are a few places, in terms of polyamorous relationships, are not allowed to be legitimized in a marriage ceremony. There are a few, very few places where that's beginning to happen. So not illegal, but polygamy itself is actually illegal in some places. So just keeping in mind that there are legal restrictions and institutional restrictions to some of these relational structures. But right here is a great chart that shows you the difference between polygamy and polyamory. Um, And polyamory is mainly what I like to speak about here in this, and that's having multiple partners with full knowledge and consent of the people involved. There may be challenges, there may be joys from that relationship structure, and it may be brought into your therapeutic relationship, and you are to validate everybody's experience regardless of how they structure their partnerships. And then there is this reality of the love industrial complex. How we love, what love looks like, is often commercialized, right? Love and romance, particularly in the context of Valentine's Day and weddings and marriage, eloping, is often co-opted by a industrial complex, which essentially is a capitalistic mechanism that tries to capitalize monetarily on love and concepts around love. And it heavily promotes and reinforces heteronormativity as the top of a hierarchy of sexuality, which is not natural. We create these hierarchies, but they are not innate to our experience as Homo sapiens sapiens or people, right? They are reinforced by institutions and society and societal norms and individuals. And in one way, these societal norms that are harmful to people that don't identify as heteronormative and monogamous are also upheld and reinforced by this love industrial complex. So just keeping in mind that there is an impact and an intersection between capitalism and our caste class system in the United States and who we love and how we structure our love. So, like always, I hope there was some value for you in this lecture. And I always want you to think, how is this short video? How is this information? That's a lot. It's a quick download in about a half an hour around identities and bias and oppression that are expansive and have real life impacts, much more than this seemingly intellectual discussion or lecture that I'm bringing to you. There's embodied experiences with oppression and with joy and love as well, and jubilation that exist around all of these identities, particularly when we're speaking of who we love and how we structure our relationships. So please always keep in mind during these mini lectures what's coming up for you, where it's coming up in the body, where it's coming up for you, how it's sitting with you, how you're feeling, and take care of yourself throughout this entire lecture. Pause it, move around, stretch, uh, process this information through your bodily experience, through your spiritual experience, through your mental and emotional experience. And please try to glean some wisdom and some insight that might help you show up better as a mental health counselor. You are not perfect, and you are not required to be perfect, but there is this expectation that you will effort to learn more about the intersection of bias and identity as a culturally competent counselor. And we hope that you choose to do that, and we support you in that process. As always, I believe you're going to be great. I believe you're going to be caring and supportive to your clients, and they are very lucky to have you in their lives. And I look forward to seeing you and speaking with you briefly for the next discussion that we have here. Have a beautiful morning, afternoon, or evening.